Greetings and God bless. Welcome to another episode of Pass the Mic. If you are listening to this and you think I am Tyler Burns, you are sorely mistaken. This is your other co-host, Dr. Jemar Tisby, and I am joined here today by a regular guest. I don't even know if we can call him a guest, one of our rotating voices as we pass the mic. Welcome to the show, Ryan Gentry.
I got a promotion.
Yeah,
I'm a regular guest now. All right.
It's one of those things by default, right? Like you're interim, and then it just goes on so long that, well, I guess this is your title. We'll take off the interim. No.
Yeah.
Tyler will be here soon, but I love sitting down and talking to you, Ryan, because like we're here and we were batch episodes, right? We record a bunch of episodes all together, and then we just kick around ideas. We just talk. We just socialize and commiserate. And I'm learning so much about you, like how you find yourself in these particular situations, which I'm sure are awkward for you at the time, but they sound hilarious in the retelling. So you were talking about an episode once where you said something and it turned out that the person you were talking to may have been slightly, I don't know, offended.
Oh, yeah. It was a small group at like a church that I was figuring out at the time back in Arizona. I was in this group with some other young adults, and someone mentioned, "Hey, have you seen the God's Not Dead movies?" And I'm pretty critical of Christian media, I feel like, and I'm not a fan of those movies for different reasons, personally. And I was like, "Oh no, I don't care for those at all." I had to watch them in school, private Christian school or whatever. Not a huge fan. And she was like, "Oh, okay. Well, I work for the studio that makes those."
Oh,
and I was like, "The first one was good. Like I like."
Walk that back a little bit.
Yeah. I was like, the first one was good. I like that. But yeah, I was so embarrassed. But that kind of got us down this rabbit hole we were talking of just Christian media, Christian movies.
Yes.
Our gripes and things that we do like about them. But
Right. So to me, it's about Christian storytelling, storytelling around Christian themes. And I think especially with film, with movies, to me, a lot like you, I have a sort of immediate reflexive reaction like, this is not going to be good. And I want to understand why that is. Is it simply the studio and the directors, and if we change the personnel behind it, who's telling the story, it can get better? Or is there something inherently, I don't know, cheesy about Christian storytelling? So you're a filmmaker, you do video, you tell stories on screen. I tell stories through writing. So I just want to have this conversation about Christian storytelling. So let's go back to those movies. God's Not Dead, first one and the second one, right?
Sure.
These are like what is this, like 10 years ago, more than?
Oh gosh, probably.
And I think there's a book it's based off of. Obviously, we've heavily researched this. But what was your, when they said, "Have you seen the God's Not movie?" Like you kind of did an eye roll, physically or internally. What was that about? What was your, when they said God's Not Dead, the movie, what did you immediately think of?
Well, for one, I think just because I watched it in school, that already docked at some points,
kind of forced.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's hard to
audience.
appreciate like classic literature because you had to read it for homework and write a report on it, so you're not going to enjoy certain stories in that context. I think the other thing was I brush against the idea of Christian media depicting unbelief or atheism in an antagonistic way. I think that's just really unhelpful. A, just from an evangelism standpoint, and B, because it feels almost callous towards people that are wrestling with belief.
Yeah.
And so I feel like a big thing in those movies was, this guy doesn't believe in God. He's evil. He's immoral. He's our antagonist for this movie, and that just doesn't seem like the mission of the church first and foremost. And our battle is not against flesh and blood. It's against powers and principalities and the dark forces, right? So, seeing a jaded college professor forcing people to admit that God is dead or whatever, it just felt, I know it's based off a true story, but that's like someone that with issues, someone that has reached that belief for a specific reason.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels weird to turn that person who has gone through existential spiritual struggle into like a mustache twisting villain that's just out to get the Christians,
Yeah. It's sort of a caricature. It's a very flat rendering of an extremely complex, nuanced topic. And that one is sort of particular to the God's Not Dead movies. It's talking about atheism, unbelief, doubt, all of those kinds of things. But I appreciate your point that like making folks who are skeptical into the enemy or the villain or the antagonist probably is actually not helpful toward promoting belief. And I think with that whole framing of, God is dead, this is what society is telling Christians, right? That actually feeds into a narrative that we see a lot in parts of U.S. Christianity, which is this perception that we're always under attack.
Right.
That society is always after us for our beliefs, that it's always targeting us as Christians for persecution, quote unquote, right? And I think that's actually a very unhelpful idea given our context in this country. Like, people are not coming after Christians the way they are in nations around the world. And we're not a minority here. So as a matter of fact, even in the federal government, they've done analysis of what faith that people in the House of Representatives and senators profess. Vast majority, well over 50%, identify as Christian. So we even have the people making laws governing our country who are Christian, which is not even to get into the general population, which is still, despite the rise in religiously unaffiliated people, which is still majority Christian. So this whole persecution complex, and then putting it into a film, into storytelling, that's one issue. With me, I'm thinking of films like War Room, Facing the Giants.
Love Facing the Giants.
Fireproof. Oh, you love that one. Okay.
Dude, I love a good sports movie, and so yeah, the bear crawl across the field.
So did they make you watch Facing the Giants at school?
Yeah, because we were also the Eagles, and we were also red, white, and blue, and also a Christian academy. So
basically
it felt,
your story.
Yeah, well, that's us. Like, in a different state or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so this was in a school environment, not a church environment?
Yeah, school environment.
But it was still...
Yeah, and I mean, sports stories are always good stories.
Right,
I feel like that's an easy genre or story to graft into kind of base that story of faith and resistance and growth and whatever into, because
it's kind of ready-made.
Yeah, it's about overcoming. Rudy's not a Christian movie, but yeah.
Go Irish.
He was at Notre Dame, right? Yeah, so yes. I guess maybe it is technically. I don't know.
Catholic, absolutely. There's faith in there. Yeah, and then a few years before it was Remember the Titans. Yeah. And that was a Disney movie, I think. But again, a sports film. Now that was focused more on like race and reconciliation and coming together. But again, sort of ready-made as a vehicle. Sports can do that. Do you think there's been from that era, like of I don't know if you saw the movie Fireproof either, but same idea. That was several years ago. I don't know, maybe even 10 years ago, right? Or more. Do you think there's been a decline? It's held steady? Christian movies coming out now are about the same? Or is the industry getting worse in your take as a filmmaker?
I think the industry is changing. I think one of the examples we talked about earlier was like The Chosen. I feel like that's a prime example of just really good Christian media. I mean, it is like
the series, right?
Yeah, okay. It's the Gospels. Just the story of Jesus, really well produced, well directed, well acted, well written, and just incredibly compelling, incredibly engaging. At least in my personal experience with it. So I think that's sort of
it's become kind of a phenomenon. I mean, it's a very popular series.
It's the zenith. I watch something like that, and I'm like, okay, why can't we do this all the time? Now, writing an original story has its own challenges. You have some pretty good source material
Yeah,
to work
exactly,
off of.
exactly. Yeah,
with
but
The
that
Chosen,
might be
yeah.
the difference, right? I told Bo he needs to be on this podcast, but he made a great point about like those are actual Bible stories,
Right.
dramatized. It's not taking some other story and trying to communicate a Christian theme through it, as so many of these contemporary Christian movies are doing. So do you think that maybe is kind of a difference, or what makes something like The Chosen work better than, like, there's less of a cringe factor, less of a cheesiness factor?
I think maybe something that they can learn, like modern Christian storytellers can learn from that show is like, look at what the story of Jesus entails. You know, it's not, I mean, obviously he runs into conflict with people that face unbelief, but it's honestly, it's more than that. It's a political story, you know? It's bucking the shackles of like a oppressive empire. It's a story of deliverance from cyclical, perpetual downtroddenness, living in sin, sickness. And it's not just like I prayed and this went away. It's like Jesus shows up and loves people through that and spends a lot of time with sinners. And I feel like the sinners in these Christian stories are somebody that is 99% good, but I drink a little bit sometimes. Or they're 99% good, but I just don't have a direction. If someone points me in the right direction, I got it figured out. There's not a lot of Christian stories, I feel like, that show that someone can be well and truly broken and that they're repaired in their relationship with God. It's always somebody that's got it all figured out, fixing somebody that has it mostly figured out, and then the people that have none of it figured out are in the back going, I don't know why you're bad, or blah, you know? It's
I think that's a good insight. It's a good insight. There's always some sort of hero in the story that helps fix the broken character, which, as you say, is usually, I wouldn't say minor, but
Sure.
you know, it's a pretty predictable kind of problem. Whether it's, I didn't have a dad at home, or you know, somebody died, which obviously is tragic, but as a storytelling device, it can be done poorly. I think that's a really, really important point there. One of the things that I think about in modern Christian storytelling is who's telling the story and why. And I mean, like, from a producer standpoint,
Sure.
writer, director, who's behind the camera, and often, and also, who's behind the money. So this is one of the things that I think makes it difficult. There's a Christian movie industry now, and what happened was they struck lightning with films like Facing the Giants, right? What it was marketing gold, it was sales gold, because what happened was entire churches would rent out theaters and invite the whole congregation to go watch. And then youth groups would do it. And then they'd show it at conferences and things of that nature. So you had this ready-made audience of millions of Christians, many of whom were white evangelical, but also, I think, interestingly, there's a lot of black churches that did the same thing. And I think what they were tapping, so they made a lot of money, is the business side, right?
As one does.
As one does. And they're like, okay, well, there's more of these stories to tell. And we found a formula, so let's not mess with a good thing that's working, bottom line wise, financial wise. And by the way, I'm not casting aspersions on the motivations of the filmmakers. I really, truly believe they spend hours and hours praying about this, talking about it, writing about it.
And you want to make something that's encouraging and powerful, and at the end of the day, you're seeking to tell like an encouraging, happy story, because you believe that that's something that's missing in the world in an expression. You feel maybe a little bit unseen, and so you're trying to make something for a group of people. Right. I think that's a really beautiful thing.
It can be, and they were tapping into a need. So it wouldn't have had the kind of box office success if there wasn't some sort of felt need on the part of Christian people for big screen movies that spoke about their faith. So in a particular way, right? That's my thing.
Yeah.
In a particular way. So it still feels very U.S. white evangelically, and part of that is who's behind the films.
Yeah.
But I mean, what do you think? How would you name or describe the felt need that these films are speaking to? We'll give you a second to think about that and come back right after the break.
Well, greetings and God bless, family. This is your host of Pastor Mike, Tyler Burns, and I am so excited that we're still doing Pastor Mike 11 years after we started. Think about this. 11 years after we started, we're still doing this. And the reason why we can do it is because people like you have supported us from the beginning. We would not still be here if not for the support of people who are our patrons. And if you go to patreon.com/Pastor Mike, if this podcast has helped you in any way, shape, or form, if we've encouraged you to think more deeply about race and justice, if we've inspired you to make change right where you are, if we've been an oasis in the desert in the midst of toxic church spaces, we need your help. We need your support. For just a few dollars every single month, you can keep us going. You literally, as our listeners, keep us going. So head to patreon.com/Pastor Mike. We're passing the mic to you for your support so that we can continue doing this podcast that so many people love. Thank you so much for your support. If you are already a patron, and if you're not, just a few dollars a month. Thank you so much.
And we're back, and I'm putting you on the spot, Ryan. What is the felt need that these films are addressing that makes them so successful? Because at the end of the day, this is a business. They wouldn't keep making these films, or at least keep making them like they are, if something wasn't working. And what's working is people keep going to see them. So, what is that? How would you describe that need or desire for these kinds of films?
Yeah, I'll give a optimistic and a pessimistic answer to that question.
Right.
I'll start
fair and balanced.
Yeah,
both sides.
Pessimistically, I feel like there's it's culture war ammunition,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It is, here's how the world is being bad to us. Here's how Hollywood doesn't want to tell these stories because they're hopeful and they have Jesus and nobody wants to talk about Jesus anymore. That's pessimistic. Maybe there's some of that. Maybe there's not. That's sort of where I feel like the culture war element can play into this industry. Optimistically, Christians are not don't have media made for them in the mainstream. And sometimes you want to be able to take your kids to a movie that is not going to have themes or messaging or whatever that could be upsetting to them, and you want something that's hey, this is going to be safe, we promise. There's not going to be anything
no gotcha, no
gotcha,
switch.
and no I guess maybe this bleeds into the culture war thing a little bit. Nothing surprising that you'll have to explain to your kids later or whatever.
Right. No banned books appear in this movie.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad you mentioned culture wars, because that's what I was trying to explain my way towards. Is the white evangelicalness of these films feels very much like part of the culture wars in a sense.
Yeah.
And I've always described it as conservatives in general, political conservatives or conservative Christians. Sometimes to me, it feels like they are still stung by the fact that they didn't sit at the cool kids table in the high school cafeteria, right?
Man, whoa.
They have this chip on their shoulder that they were never included in the in group of popular people, of hip, cool people, cutting edge, whatever. And now they are doing everything they can to say, well, I'm going to form my own table, right? I don't need you guys anyway. And these movies sort of feel like that too. Well, you won't tell our stories in the major film studios or whatever. Well, we're going to go and take our. Now, I don't think it's that overt in their thinking of it, but that's to me the way it comes across a little bit with all these sort of parallel / alternative Christian genres, right? In music, there was a whole Christian rock and roll music. I'm talking not even CCM.
Yeah.
I'm talking heavy metal band kind of things.
Let's get rid of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll or part of sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Exactly. We can keep the rock and roll part, but whatever. And I do feel like there's some of that going on in the Christian storytelling in popular media, and it does feel part of the culture wars too. I think in addition, there is a sense in these movies, again, Bo mentioning, like they're playing out a fantasy or imagining a desire, a world that they want to be true, which to me fundamentally is we overcome through our faith.
Yeah.
I think that's the bottom line in almost all of these movies, is that faith overcomes everything. And I think obviously on a theological level, there's something to that. But in a Christian storytelling thing, it makes for a very kind of flat, predictable storyline. I think you were making a comment during the break about there's almost an absence of conflict in these films. So talk more about that.
I think the frustration I run into is I feel like faith in these movies is always a forward progression. And I think in a broader sense that there's more nuance there, right? Like you go through cycles of orientation, disorientation, reorientation. And the struggle of trying to figure out what it looks like to follow God in your life, I feel like for me at least, has not always been forward moving.
Not linear.
Yeah. It's not linear. Sometimes you take a detour and frustration and questions, and that's how it is for a lot of people, even in scripture. I'm reading through Job right now.
Right.
And so I think this is like kind of fresh.
Yes, yeah.
Fresh in my mind is like, even the resolution in Job, there's a lot of tension there, you know? It's not like, hey, everything is good now, you know? And I feel like in these movies, it's always God fixes this problem and you're better off in the end.
Yes.
Like on every standard, the world's standard, you're richer, you win the football game, your community is repaired, your marriage is fixed. And I feel like if you look at life, that's not always how it goes. And so instead of the beauty of depicting the struggle and the tension there, I feel like it's a lot of the themes are like a Band-Aid. Like glory to God, God does restore and God does repair, but it's almost small-minded to think that repair and that healing looks the way that the world would want it to look. You know?
That's a great point.
It's like your faith is just sort of a spoken prayer in these movies of God fix this thing. And then by worldly standards, it's fixed, you know? Which if you're truly going to believe in like being a member of a people that are set apart and called to be holier, things don't work out that way, which I feel like is really ironic given like the self-persecution view of a lot of like the culture war stuff we talked about. Why is this resolution making making life easier all the time? You know?
This is getting deep. Okay, so you said a lot there. Number one, I think no. These are great ideas. So I'm just teasing out some of the thoughts that I had. One is, I think part of my reticence with these movies is there's always a bow tied neatly at the end. You know, it's done. The problem is fixed. It's solved. And then how does it get resolved? Through prayer and faith and your own individual actions. Maybe some people come around and support you, right? But it's mainly you cleaning up your act. Oh, I stopped watching these films or listening to this music, or I started praying or going to church, right? All of these very kind of basic, perceived as holy actions, or at least upstanding, whatever. And then at the end, it's fixed.
Yeah.
You got the girl, the marriage is fixed, you prayed the disease away, you know, whatever it might be. And like you're saying, life doesn't work like that. So that's part of my you know, another one comes out, you kind of know what you're gonna get. It's almost a Hallmark movie formula. Like you always know.
It kind of is.
How the
maybe like a
romance is gonna
step
play
up
out.
from Hallmark. Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. But I mean, and you know, there's room for feel good movies, I guess, right?
Absolutely.
Like you absolutely want.
It's necessary.
There are some movies that you know you're just gonna come out happy.
Yeah.
That's part of it. But in the solving of the problem, quote unquote, there's also not really dealing with systems and institutions, which you know is my thing, right?
Yeah.
Like as I talk about racial justice, you know, there's a reason why this family is poor. There's a reason why this person is in jail. There's even perhaps reasons why, certain communities are more prone to physical illnesses being in proximity to factories and chemicals and all of those things. These Christian films, and this is the white evangelicalness of it, and maybe even the culture wars of it, tend never to deal with the broader societal problems and implications. And then lastly, to your point about, the winning in very predictable, external, earthly, societal approved ways, more and more in the context of justice, what I'm emphasizing to people is, you know what? We may not win.
Yeah.
We may not win the external battles, meaning the law isn't passed, the policy isn't changed, your preferred candidate doesn't win, those kinds of things. But in the midst of that, who we become
absolutely
while pursuing justice, while doing the right thing, while pursuing righteousness, that's just as important. And so I think there's maybe room in the Christian storytelling genre for the character not to win in an earthly sense, but to become, which I think Jesus is just as, if not more, concerned about than the externals.
Right.
So as we land this plane, you're a filmmaker. You tell stories. What would you do? How would you improve upon the genre? And you're pitching.
I love the term like character driven. I feel like a lot of these characters, the main thing about their personality is the one flaw, the easily fixable flaw, and then that they believe in God. I feel like telling a story in which there's actually more fleshed out about who these individuals are, because then their personal choices mean something. You know why they're choosing something. It's not just this binary of he's picking this or she's picking this because she'll be closer to God or she'll be further away from God. Like she's doing the bad thing by being further away. She's doing the good thing and moving the plot forward by choosing God. I feel like so much, especially the Old Testament stories. There's so many, a lot of good, a lot of bad. But they're like
very
they're
dramatic.
Great. Yeah, they're great dramatic stories, and it's about that binary. But instead, it's sort of here's how these people are messing up. Like here's how Saul chooses to go to a witch and do necromancy or whatever, because he's obsessed with holding on to his power. He's afraid of losing his power. Instead, I feel like these movies are telling the story of like, Saul looked away from God and so he's done the wrong thing. It's like, no, why is he doing that?
Right.
And I think that's what these stories are missing is like really good fleshed out characters that have an empathetic struggle. There's such an absence of struggle outside of this really zoomed out idea of pursuing God and not pursuing God, which is a really important thing to depict. But I feel like if you get into the nitty and the gritty, like there's something really cool there of why these people are making these choices. So I think it's such a, like, I feel like a film school 101 answer, but like more character driven stories instead of telling a story about like a cookie cutter person that ultimately picks God. How does God enter into this story and change this person's heart, not just circumstances? And I feel like we see some heart change, but on a very general level. It's more on circumstances.
I think it's a great answer because we're fundamentally talking about storytelling. And so you got to go back to the elements of storytelling. And it's almost always people driven. And do we care about the character? And there's always more nuance, more shades, more variety in a person's choice, especially when it comes to religion and morality. Like those are not easy stories to tell.
Yeah.
So I'm already drawn in. If it was me, I'm telling historical stories.
Right.
And I think that faith is embedded in them. So you can talk about any kind of stories, like
You're making biopics.
right?
Yeah,
exactly. And faith is in there as an element. Now, what I'm trying to wrap my brain around is how you show that the character is deeply driven by their religious beliefs without like, I'm going in my prayer closet.
Yeah.
I'm going to pray this about, how to do that in a non-cheesy way. But I mean, that's what I write about in The Spirit of Justice. Like, it's there, it's present, it's all over the place. You catch it in snatches of quotes and dialogue. You catch it in the fact that people are carrying around Bibles or spiritual books like MLK did, right? There's so many different sort of subtle ways that say this character's choices are shaped and driven by who they believe God to be and how they believe God has set the world up to work. So we have a rich tapestry of characters and stories already told in Scripture. We have a rich tapestry and set of characters throughout our history that we can draw on. And I don't think we always have to follow this almost formulaic storytelling that we see in the Christian film industry.
Yeah, and also maybe there's some rated R Christian movies in there somewhere, Like I mentioned the Old Testament before. Like, we love Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Look up what Judah was up to during those first couple years that Joseph's in Egypt. Like, like look at the book of Judges or something like that. There's some valuable lessons to be learned from some stories that aren't
G-rated.
aren't Veggie Tales-able,
Aren't youth group ready?
Yeah, they're not youth group ready. And I think that's okay, the Bible, Scripture is different every time you open it. And you look at it with a different lens every time you open it. And so I feel like these people that maybe don't want to bring their kids to the theater, there's stories for adults that are like intense and they're full of that tension. I think there's plenty of room for the family-friendly, palatable, feel-good Christian movie. I think it's a really good thing, actually, is to show your kids like easy to understand expressions of faith, but show us some struggle, show us some brutality and some conflict in the walk as we pursue God.
We can go from milk to solid food.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, I'm sold. If anybody out there wants to finance and fund the Christian film that Ryan and I will come up with and create, we are now accepting donations. You can go to patreon.com/passthemic. And thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Pass the Mic. We'll see you next time.